Ruler School is brought to you by Odyssey Games, where you can go to pre-order upcoming Force of Will sets, ccgprime.com for singles and supplies, cardodoco.com for those rulers in the international market looking for product, the Ruler School Circuit Series now taking orders on our Q3 2024 circuit kits, and our guest lecturer members, Fight Ramen. Class is in session.
Hey there guys, welcome back to Ruler School with yours truly, Paul Reisman. Today, as the teaching assistant, I'm going to help us break down the Battle for the Sacred Ruins metagame. There's a lot of stuff going on with this new set, a lot of really powerful new cards, a lot of really useful cards that have come out that have really changed the way that we are deck building and playing the game of Force of Will at this stage in 2024. So some folks have been really frustrated by what's been going on here with the different regalia that are being played, like Broken Mask of the Crusader. Specifically, this card is probably the best regalia that was printed in this past set. It does have Untouchable, Barrier J Resonator, so it's kind of difficult to get rid of. It's not something you can cancel on the chase. It is something that has to resolve, and then you take care of it while it's on the field. It's a regalia, so all of our addition removal is not very useful against it because most of that stuff does not hit regalia. It taxes all of those non-resonator spells that could be used to get rid of it, but it also taxes non-will activate abilities by having you pay one additional if you're not Glorious or Faria, which most people are not. This card singularly has brought that ruler back into vogue because we've had a lot of inheritance power creep in the recent sets and a lot of rules changes on cards and erratas on cards that have made Glorious a little bit more of a better ruler, much more of a control style ruler. And at the beginning of the game, you can kind of just cheat this card into the field and draw an additional card. So this card's just going to come out onto the field for really well. If you go over to your hypergeometric calculator and you look at your first 10 cards, if you're looking for at least one mask to show up, you are looking at a 70% flat chance to see at least one mask in your opening hand. So this card, if you are playing it, you're going to see it more often than you won't see it. A majority of the time this card will be in your hand, which means this card will hit the field. And if you're a deck that does rely on some sort of race-based strategy, things like treasures, things like fairy tale decks, this card is really going to make that a really uphill climb for you to play against, because this card is just going to shut off all of the abilities that rely on that race being printed on the card. So Broken Mask of the Crusader has been really giving people a lot of grief alongside things like Star Scale of the Sacred Dragon. Not only does this prevent burn damage, it has the cheat in ability that the masks have if you are playing solo mode, and your opponent can only do one judgment, revolution order, contract, or transcend process per game, respectively. This is retroactive, so this card comes in after you have performed a judgment or a rev order or a contract or a transcend. It will see that you have done that, and you will not be able to do so for the rest of the game until this card is removed. And a lot of people are finding that this card is frustrating for that particular reason, and mostly because once this card hits, barrier is going to make it really, really difficult to get off the field. It also makes it so that your magic stones without a magic stone type cannot be recovered in any way as long as their controller doesn't control a J/ruler with Millium in its name. So what does that mean? It means all of our first C stones get moved out of the format prematurely. It also means that if you're playing things like your Moonshades, your Ataragdia's Memorias, Ruler's Memoria, Ragnarok's Fiery Stone, this card is going to prevent those cards from being recovered, and so you basically don't have access to your mana in that scenario. Albeit, a lot of people are not playing this in the main board, but they are playing it in the sideboard, and so a lot of people are seeing that piece of being told, this is how we have to play the game now, and they're a little bit frustrated with that. A little bit understandable from where I'm sitting. I know people don't like being told this is how you have to play the game, but you know, here we are. This is where we're at. I'm just going to move up our screen here a little bit so you can see the full text of the card. So the other card, it's much less of an issue that we're seeing, is Accursed Ice Shards. This card basically just says we're going to take your RFG and your graveyard and just throw it out of the game for that one God's Art ability. So if you are just really reliant on the graveyard or on the RFG, or if you're used to playing things from outside the game or from your graveyard, you are going to have a really hard time against this particular card. I don't like that this card exists because I am an Athenia player, but it is good that we do have just like, hey, anti-reanimation strategy. We do have something that can just stop that in games 2 and 3. It's really good to have that sort of counterbalance strategy. It is untouchable, but it doesn't have barriers. You can get rid of this card, but it also, of course, has quick cast. So if your opponent is playing very smartly, they will just hold on to this card until they need it and then activate the God's Art, removing your stuff from the game. So Accursed Ice Shards, a little bit less of an issue, but some people do see this card as an issue as well. On top of that, we do have, to some lesser degree, the Academy City's Expert Therapist. It has the blanking of race effects. It also means that your stuff, entities you control cannot be, or entities in general cannot be recovered by spells or abilities while this card is on the field, including your own stuff, which is kind of a nice counterbalance to the card, but still the fact remains that this card is just another floodgate. It does make Leon a much harder deck to play, though if you saw my tournament report for Milan, it didn't really stop the 2 Leon players from making top 8 anyway. That's a story for another day, but this card is going to be really hard to get rid of once it hits the field. It doesn't have Untouchable, it does have Barrier Chant, it can't be banished or removed from the game or expelled if you are playing solo mode. This card is just kind of hard to get rid of in some ways. And so for what this card is, it is really trying to push the game back, in a sense, to a time in which economy strategies like Leon or even Lucy to some degree, right? Because Lucy also requires elemental, spirits in order to play her strategy. This card basically invalidates that alongside of Mask. We also have High Speed Uppercut treatment. This card is going to be used a lot to just throw the copies of a card that you have in your graveyard and just take all copies of those in your hand, deck, graveyard, RFG, and just remove them from the game altogether. They are expelled. And so this card could potentially be an issue, although I find this card a lot more tolerable than, and I think a lot of other people do too. The High Speed Uppercut treatment is not that big of an issue, and neither is Zacky's New Plan. This card, to some degree, I'm not actually sold on this card being as powerful as I initially thought it was going to be. It is an expelling of a water card in your hand for a free effect, so that, you know, classic Force of Will from MTG effect, where you can just pay alternative costs to make this card happen for free. I definitely thought this card was going to be much more of a problem, but the narrow window for which this card is usable seems to be relatively well contained by its own restrictions. So this card seems relatively okay. It's kind of in the same category for me now as High Speed Uppercut treatment. That's the word. I couldn't think of the middle word there, but here we are. So these are the kind of the cards that are still maintaining the bounds of the metagame, alongside, of course, Curse Mirror of the Snake. If you're not playing against a Mask deck, this card is still very, very strong, but Mask is a very good way of making this card feel absolutely awful. It's a treasure, so it's going to get blanked in Leon decks, and it's going to be taxed as well. So this card is definitely, it feels a lot worse under Mask. So if this is the metagame, what are we going to do about it? Some folks have already recognized that Suya is a pretty decent card this format. Turn 1 Suya against your opponent who plays out a Mask without anything else is pretty good. It just gets rid of the Mask altogether. It makes your opponent banish the card, so it does get around barrier. So that means they could also get around Star Scale as well, because even though Star Scale has barrier, this card does get around that. It's probably the best all-around answer. We're not seeing as many Star Scales though. I don't think we're going to see that many outside of the sideboard. So I think Suya in general is just going to be anti-mask, and that's kind of why we looked at mask counters in general, and like what could we possibly use to get around mask even if we are taxed by this card. Kind of what do we do? So first of all, there is a little bit of a combination here. Spirits of the Crimson Moon may not be able to actually hit the mask itself, but one thing it can do is cheat itself out onto the field as a 2-cost resonator, meaning that you can pay 2 then to play Tinkerbell and destroy all entities your opponent controls, including the mask itself. So that you are going to have to reveal this card from your hand for 2 instead of just 1 white will, but you are going to be able to just blow up your opponent's field. This does get around barrier, and none of these regalia have eternal, so this card is very helpful for that in general. So there are decks that can utilize this toolbox very well, including things such as Grim decks. So Grim decks will naturally include Tinkerbell as part of this, as well as Spirit of the Crimson Moon. It is a fairy tale, and it does get around some things. Even though these cards will lose their Resonator Race effect, they will not lose the removing a light card in your hand effect. Light is not something you can get rid of. It's an attribute of the card itself. So right now we don't have anything like that that's going to get rid of it. So this is still a very viable strategy. So it's not something that is completely invalidating strategies entirely. These are just cards you can include in your deck sometimes. You do have things like Spirit Ring as well. These are really good cards for getting rid of additions and regalia, because when you enter, you may destroy target non-magic stone, non-J resonator entity. Hey, look, regalia falls into that criteria. So Spirit Ring is really good for that. You are paying 2 because it is an addition. It's a non-resonator spell under mask, and so you are paying 2 to make this happen. But it is really useful to be able to just say, hey, I'm just going to pop this thing. A lot of decks use additions now as just a strategy component, so this card is really useful for that particular thing. We also have Seal of Lenneth. Now this is kind of like Spirit Ring, but it's a little bit more flexible. You do have to pay 2 under the mask, but it does just get rid of it, and if your opponent doesn't have a way of getting rid of this addition, it's not coming back. So it is kind of useful for that. If you're not playing against a mask deck, this is really useful for getting rid of anything else your opponent might have as well, short of the Star Scale. I will say though, the reason we're not focusing too much on Star Scale is because you can just form your stone deck in such a way with all of the different magic stone options that we have to play dual stones or tri-stones that do have a magic stone type. So you're able to just kind of skirt around Starfall altogether, or sorry, you're able to move around Star Scale relatively easily by just building your deck differently. So we're not really focusing on that, but we do get the ability to just get rid of mask for 2, which can be really helpful if you are trying to do something on your opponent's turn, or in general, you're just trying to get rid of the mask so you can actually have a game plan. This card does really good at that. You also can just play Girl Staring At and blank the mask for 3 will. It does get taxed under mask. However, if you're able to blank mask, or, you know, if your opponent has Star Scale, this gets rid of their barrier relatively easy as well. You can just destroy it with, you know, any sort of generic removal that you might have access to. So Girl Staring At is a very powerful card right now. It is a one-sided field blank for your opponent. That makes it so that you can unlock certain boards. It's really, really helpful for that. So Girl Staring At is also an option. A lot of these are in white, by the way, but we do have cards in other colors as well. We do have Alice's Fantastic Trick. There are some ways for you to proc this sort of pseudo-torrent ability to get rid of things like mask if you need to. This won't get rid of things like Therapist, unfortunately, but it's still really useful for getting rid of mask in that sense. And it is quick cast, so you can do it on your opponent's turn as well, even under the tax. Moving into red, we have one very good anti-regalia card. In red, Regalia Break. Destroy a Regalia, draw a card. It's quick cast. It's going to cost 200 mask, but you know what? I'll pay 2 to get rid of that thing that unlocks my entire deck. So really helpful. It also has Excalibur, which is a very strong Regalia, right? Overall, this thing is being utterly destroyed. But here we are. We're playing Regalia Break, getting rid of mask, drawing a card, moving on with our day. And of course, we do have Random Walk too. From the same cluster, we do have a way of engaging with Regalia. This says put target Resonator with total cost 1 or less, or target Regalia on bottom of the owner's deck. So just getting rid of mask in general on turn 1. If you put this to the bottom of the deck, it's probably not going to come back, and your opponent is probably not going to, you know, play mask unless they see a lot of value in it, in which case you do still have answers in the deck, and it feels a lot worse for them to try and play it later. So Random Walk, just get rid of it, put it on the bottom of the deck, just make it so they probably will never ever see it again. Random Walk is very, very useful for that in blue. You'll note that I'm not playing Hera. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. She is a Resonator. So as you can clearly see here, Broken Mask cannot be targeted by J/Resonators. Hera is a Resonator, so don't at me. Random Walk is your best choice in blue. I also have Destructive Assault in here because I think this card, very similar to Seal of Lenneth, is useful in that it can destroy additions and Regalia. Really helpful for that in particular. We also have this in Heavenly Gust, which came relatively soon after Destructive Assault. It does cost you a little bit more, and it can torrent to destroy all additions and Regalia your opponent controls. That's really useful as well. This card has value. It also can't be mirrored, so there's some value in that as well. If you're playing in a situation in which you're playing this card and your opponent doesn't have mask, but you're afraid of getting hit by mirror, Destructive Assault might not feel nearly as useful. But this card is relatively cheap, and it is a promo as well, so if you want to bling out, you can do that. You can also play Spark of Life. Destroy target J-Ruler you control and a target non-Magic Stone entity your opponent controls. If you're playing J-Rulers that you can blow up, this is really useful in the sense that it can just do anything. The reason I say this is because Fox players will really like Spark of Life. Spark of Life is really useful for paying 2, trying to destroy your Fox and pop their mask for 2, but you don't care because your Fox, once it's flipped into its J-Ruler form, can't be destroyed. So that's really useful for Fox players. And there's some other rulers that, you know, don't mind trying to get blown up if they have Eternal. This card is really good for that. So I decided to include this. It is generic entity removal. We talked about Suya already. I think it's also really helpful to have Curse of Ragnarok on this card to just get rid of something in your opponent's hand. So this card does have longevity later into the game. Cage of Mother Goose, very interesting card. You can just pay with this card with a Fairy Tale J/Resonator you control, but your mask is going to blank those effects. So if you end up playing this for 2, up into 3, this might be an option for you as well, and it does something very similar to Seal of Lenneth. So I just thought I'd put this in here. It's available. It's an addition. It might be useful to you. Personally, I would probably play Seal of Lenneth over it, but it is an option if you want to do that instead. And then, of course, we have the generic Maribel the Steel Doll. This card is very flexible in the sense that it can be slotted into any deck regardless of color identity. And so with this card, you just play it for free, and then for 1 and tapping it and banishing it, you can destroy target Regalia your opponent controls. So it's going to get around mask. But you will have to pay 2 for the activate ability. So at the end of the day, you're paying 2 to get rid of a card that is ultimately going to inhibit you in general. So these are the basic answers that we have for Broken Mask of the Crusader. Therapist is going to be a little bit more of an issue. It is something that you can use precision to attack into. I would suggest you look into that. It's going to be really useful. It can be destroyed. in under solo mode. So just be aware of that. It just can't be banished. It can't be removed from the game or expelled. It can't. It just can't get hit with that. It can't be targeted by chance. But you can do things like attack it and kill it with things with precision. That would be my my greatest advice to you at this point, getting around this card. Now, of course, there are rulers that are really useful for popping certain things in the game currently and doing some really interesting things based on the format. Of course, I'm going to start with Olivia. I think she's a really strong, just like all-around ruler in general. She does have Surging Lightning, which can pop honestly any of these cards because it gets around barrier, which is really great. So for star scale, you can just pop it with Surging Lightning because it gets around barrier and it just gets rid of it in general. Very fun, very cool. You also can get around Broken Mask with that as well because it's a chant and not a J/Resonator. So you just pay 2 and destroy this on your opponent's turn. Really very useful for that in general. And so she also has things like Pulsing Thunder, which gets rid of all of your opponent's regalia and additions. Very useful card in general. So if you're an Olivia stan like me, there's only 2 of us in the world, I think. I don't know. Let me know down in the comment section down below if you are also an Olivia stan, but I'm pretty sure it's only me and Pat at this point. Olivia has some answers inherently built into her package that help you get rid of Mask, etc. Glorious can use Mask, which is really helpful, and it can tax your opponent, and we've actually seen some success with this ruler in terms of its applicability. So Glorious does have value in terms of what it can do in the metagame currently. I also think that what we need to look at in the format are things like Faria, and I'll explain why here as I go down into my notes section. You want strategies that can do the following. You want strategies that first and foremost can manage the tax imposed by Broken Mask, decks that are more Resonator focused so that they are not taxed by Mask. You need 2 drops that avoid Curse Mirror of the Snake, will sinks, so things that are easy to sink your will into, that are very, very valuable in the long run, so you can get a lot of value just from you know, going long into the game, and things that ramp stones into the field, things like Guardian Dragon of the Kingdom that can bring in new fresh stones, or things like the Scorpion and Red Wine and Bread package we've been seeing in some of the GP level events. Those are really good ways of getting around Mask. Things that are things like Sacred Elf or the new Shiitake, Professor Shiitake, are really helpful for getting around some of the taxing effects of Mask as well. And I think Faria fits the bill for a deck that is able to get around the taxing ability of Mask because she's mostly a Resonator focused deck. Also, all of her guidance abilities, these are things that happen as automatic abilities, not necessarily something that are activate abilities. And so there is an option for you to simply say, I'm just going to play Resonators and just win the game that way. Faria is very strong for that reason. Do we talk about Zacky, or do we talk about Zacky? Zacky's weird. I'm not entirely sure what to do about her yet. I'm still in this stage where I'm not sure if she's a good ruler or not. People are experimenting with her because of the double mulligan that you get, as well as the pseudo quick cast ability she has for cards with Investigate when you play her with solo mode. So there's some interesting things going on here. I'm just not entirely sure what we're going to be doing with this. It seems like she's actually very shut down by Mask if you rely too much on clues and going into that and going in that direction. But her Resonators aren't very strong either. So I'm wondering if she's just going to turn into a generic solo ruler control shell, and that's where we go. And we use the double mulligan to try and do what we used to do with Feasting and just sculpt her hand and win the game that way, and then just play things on my opponent's turn that can't be interacted with things like Pharaoh's Spell. Interesting ruler. I'm not sure what to do with her yet, but there is a lot of potential there. And so I'm not ruling her out, but things aren't looking great. We'll just say that. Things like Alice, Tales of Creation, order deck, so it gets around mirror relatively well. Also has a really aggressive base strategy. This deck can play its Priscia card, which if you don't know what that card does, it does just a ton of burn damage. It's very fast in that way. So you can hone this deck to play in that style, or you can just play a bunch of things like 3 Tea Party members and just aggro your opponent out of the game. Even without IU, this deck is still really powerful. Plus, she gets access to things like Linosfaria for a really cheap cost, and that will blank your opponent's stuff on your turn, meaning that you can just play Fantastic Trick and pop that mask for your normal cost. Linosfaria is very good for that particular reason, so don't count out Order Alice quite yet. Same thing with Odin. Odin, you know, even under star scale, Odin usually only orders once anyway. But the fact that, you know, you can just play a bunch of like, just a bunch of really good resonators, and just, you know, order those things out, and they're going to be really hard to get rid of. Odin is just really good at excelling and cleaving through other control decks that might be using things like Mask, for instance. So Odin is very good at that. He has got a lot of really interesting things that are going on here. He can play the long game if he uses his automatic ability on his order to get rid of Asgard from the deck, which will then come into the field and give you drain capabilities for the rest of the game. There's a lot of really interesting things you can do here, even if his board barrier spell gets taxed, you're still only paying 1 because of how that card interacts with Odin himself. So there's a lot of ways that Odin can kind of skirt around Mask, and you know, even though he can't really use it because order doesn't correspond with solo mode, he can just kind of get around Mask. So I still think this ruler has some legs going for him. Shiva, we've also seen put up some results. I still think there's something there. You're probably not going to be doing your combo stuff too much with your stones, but you do have things like Robo Meta, which under order do become kind of scary in the sense that you're playing this really, really big guy. Although the bigness of the guy is kind of delayed a little bit until you can get more will sunk into him. But for the most part, I think Shiva has abilities to be used because Rigveda is also a very strong card in general. So like there's something here with Shiva. I think Shiva does have some value in general. I do think Athenia, I'm one of these people that advocates for rulers that nobody plays, but I do think Athenia has some value. She did just get back Spirit of Decay, which is really helpful. She can order only once if needed, playing things like Aborizuki or playing other resonators that can get cheaper like Shinjiro. There are ways to play Spirit of Decay and just make your opponent cry. Of course, she does have some issues with ice shards. So there are ways for you to build Athenia that can get around ice shards a little bit and kind of manage those things a little bit. But in general, I mean, unless you're playing against ice shards, which we're not seeing a lot of those copies in the sideboard, this might just be a dark horse pick for you. She can be kind of hard to run, but we have tons of videos about those in the archive for the channel, so make sure to go back and check those out. We also have Belial Astema. Belial in particularly being the more important piece of this, because at the end of the day, you're playing Prideful Rule for 2. You can pop your opponent's mask, generate a 6/6, which now gets a little bit bigger. It has 2/2/2 and Bane, in addition to it, you know, it being a Fallen Angel Resonator token. So it's going to have Flying, Bane, and a 6/6. Very powerful effect to just get rid of your opponent's stuff. You're going to have about a 70% chance to see that by just being a Belial deck. So that's a pretty good counter. Just as often as your opponent will have Mask, you will just as often have the chance to have a Prideful Rule in hand. So that's really, really helpful. You also have access then to things like Astema, which gives you more will when you do pop things. So being able to say, I'm going to use Prideful Rule, immediately be refunded that will, be giving myself a resonator in the process, and having one resonator on the field that is incredibly threatening as well. Very useful. You also can just draw a card instead of generating the will that you are sinking into Prideful Rule under the tax. So there's a lot of really good benefits to running Belial Astema in the metagame right now. You also, of course, we've been seeing a lot of Almirius, Grisbalesta, and Mujdart decks. Of course, Almirius Mujdart is not a deck anymore. You can't play that, but you can do things with Grisbalesta in particular to do some pretty nutty things in general in the early game. If your opponent does have Mask, you just don't get Firestone. Like, you just don't get Fiery Stone, the Ragnarok Stone. You just get something else that makes more sense for what you were trying to do. Maybe a Tri-Stone that helps you to correct your colors for whatever's in your hand. You also have Mylist. I think Mylist flipping and doing a whole bunch of damage with his enter ability is really powerful. And I do think Burn has a place in the metagame, but it certainly has to think about how it's going to play around Mask. And I think playing Resonators and playing Burn Resonators is certainly still a viable option, especially since you can also just Judgment Mujdart, and she's a flyer that has a bunch of stats depending on the number of cards you have in your hand. Card's very good in general, so I still think the 6 Ages have value. They also get access to a powerful card like Welser as part of their package, which means that they can put certain things back into your opponent's hand without having to run Chance. So that's definitely a huge leg up that they have compared to the rest of the metagame. As far as Grim Rulers go, I do think there are a lot of things that benefit in this metagame that are still really strong in this metagame. I do think Seer decks have something going for them. So the fact that you can just pay 1 to play something face down is really helpful. You can pop things that are ultimately going to get you more value as the game goes on. And of course, these are control decks. So if you're playing for the long game, you can just say, I just accept that Mask exists, and I'm going to play answers in the main board to get rid of those things. And then I'm just going to continue on with my plan and lock my opponent out of the game. If they're playing Mask, they may not be able to play without Mask. And I think that's something that control decks can really maximize on. In addition, you have things like Christie. Again, you're filtering a card at the start of the game. But if your opponent does have Mask and you don't get that, it's not the biggest thing in the world to cry about. Again, you're probably playing this in a control deck, and you can still play things like your Hunting Ground and your Resonators to fetch things out of your opponent's hand and get rid of them, because at the end of the day, Hunting Ground, even if it does cost 2 under Mask, you do get a lot of value out of it if you're able to play things like Alberic. Lumia is the same. Lumia has a lot of value as well. If you are able to get a lot of things out of the game and play Lumia's Rage to just burn the game and call it a day, it gets around Witch of Quenchfire because it's a white spell, and it's a one cost card. So the Mask is going to be really hard to. It's going to be really hard for Mask to tax you into a cost prohibitive playing of that card in particular. Paying 2 for a card that you were ultimately going to pay 1 for, and the game is still pretty good. Lumia still has value in that way. Bahamut also, you're paying 1 to search for a dragon, but dragons are very strong, so I think Bahamut still has value. He's also got the capability of being a little bit more aggressive as a red ruler and being an early red ruler, so he has that focus attached to him. There is aggro potential in Bahamut decks. Alice decks, in general, I'm not really sure how to classify this. They are kind of hampered by Therapist a little bit, but these decks do have value, especially when you're able to search your deck with things like Bahamut. You are able to kind of get around a few things. You can play Regalia Break and Random Walk in those versions, as well as Maribel. So you can get rid of the Mask if you really need to. So these decks, I don't think they're prohibitively absent from the metagame. You just have to be creative enough to be able to say, I'm going to get rid of Mask, and that's just how this game is going to go. Same thing with the Ebony Prophet. We did see that there was a deck with Scheherazade that topped in, I think it was Milan. I think it was 8th place was an Abdul and Sherry deck. It was the only one in the tournament. So control decks can definitely still exist, and the fact that you can flip Abdul and just say you still don't have enter effects and that's not taxed by Mask is still incredibly strong. So I think there's still an argument to be made for some of the Grim decks, and there might be other rulers too that I just didn't say I'm interested in these rulers, but there might be some rulers out there that still have a lot of value. So let me know what you guys think. I think that the metagame is definitely diversified. There are ways to answer things like Mask of the Crusader in ways that are satisfying and counterplayable, but I definitely hear players' frustrations, and so hopefully this video gave you some tools for which you can use to get out of those frustrating situations. Just remember that there are strategies out there that can do a little bit better than others, decks that can manage the tax, decks that are more resonator focused, 2-drops that can avoid Curse Mirror if you are not playing against a Mask, things that are will sinks that are really helpful for getting around the activate abilities of certain things that are in the metagame, and then ramping into stones as well is also a really powerful effect on resonators that we have in the game. As long as you remember some of those things and your deck has the capability of maybe doing a few of those things, or even just making it so your opponent has a blank field and that, you know, the Mask doesn't actually work. The metagame is still pretty diverse, pretty open, and I think you can still have a good time playing Force of Will. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think down in the comment section down below. Is Mask manageable? Is it something that should never have been printed, or are you hoping it gets banned? What else would you think the company could do to help us shape the metagame, not only as players, but from the company side as well? Let us know what you think down in the comment section down below. And if you would like videos like this in the future, these more discussion-oriented videos, strategy-based videos, let us know down there as well. Until next time, guys, this has been Paul saying class is dismissed.